According to Fish and Wildlife, birdwatchers in the U.S. spend $107 billion on birding trips and equipment every year.
Most people think birding is small, quiet, harmless. A slow Sunday hobby for retirees with binoculars and a thermos of coffee. That's what I thought too. But then I watched Listers, the viral birding documentary on YouTube. In it, they cite a government report that includes a figure that shocked me. 96 million. According to the 2022 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service analysis on birding, that's how many Americans actively bird. 96 million. That's more than 1 in 3 adults. And suddenly, the story didn't make sense anymore. If birding is that big, why does it feel invisible? Why don't we talk about it like we talk about football? Where are the headlines, the sponsorships, the mainstream buzz? So I started digging, and the deeper I went, the stranger it got. There were billions of dollars involved, over 1 million jobs, entire regions of the country where birding participation rivals anything else outdoors. This wasn't a niche hobby. This was something else. As I went further down that rabbit hole, what I found out completely changed the way I see birding in America. Let's start with clue number 1. If you're going to solve a mystery, you start with the biggest piece of evidence. So let's go back to that number. 96 million Americans. That's how many people, age 16 and older, actively watched birds in 2022. Not casually noticing a robin while mowing the lawn. Not glancing at a pigeon while walking to work. The survey used a strict definition. To count, you had to either travel at least a mile from home specifically to observe birds, or actively try to identify birds around your home. By that standard, 96 million people qualified. That's 37% of the U.S. population, more than 1 out of every 3 adults. Let that sink in. If American birders formed their own country, it would be one of the largest nations on Earth. If they formed a voting bloc, they could swing national elections. If they were a sports league, they would dwarf most professional fan bases. And yet, birding still feels invisible. You don't see nightly news segments about record migration weekends. You don't see birders filling stadiums. There are no flashy halftime shows. So the first clue creates a paradox. Birding is massive, but it doesn't act massive, which makes you wonder, are all 96 million people really doing the same thing? Or are we lumping together very different kinds of birders? To answer that, we have to look closer. Here's where the second clue changes everything. Out of those 96 million birders, about 91 million watch birds around their home. Backyards, apartment balconies, local parks within walking distance. That's 95%. Suddenly, the mystery starts to unravel. Most birding isn't dramatic. It isn't epic migration chases or rare vagrant alerts blowing up group chats. It's quiet. It's daily. It's woven into ordinary life. And that might be why it feels smaller than it is. Because when something happens in millions of separate backyards instead of one giant stadium, it doesn't look like a movement. It looks like solitude. But here's the twist. 43 million take trips at least a mile from home specifically to bird. 43 million traveling birders is still enormous. That's tens of millions of people willing to leave home, spend gas money, maybe book lodging or buy a plane ticket, all for the chance to see a bird. So now the picture is more complex. Birding isn't one thing. It's split between the casual observer and the committed chaser. And if we want to understand how big birding really is, we have to figure out who these people are. Because numbers are one thing, but people tell the real story. If you believe the stereotype, you may think you already know the answer. Birding is for retirees. That's the image most of us carry around. Gray hair, hiking boots, maybe a pair of binoculars hanging from a weathered strap. Here's what the data says. The single largest group of birders in America is people over 65, about 23 million of them. Right behind them, the 55 to 64 age group, another 19 million. Altogether, roughly 44% of all birders are over the age of 55. So yes, The stereotype isn't completely wrong. Participation does increase with age, so as Americans get older, they're more likely to bird. But here's where the story gets interesting. The younger age groups are surprisingly large. Roughly 56% are actually younger than 55 years old. Millions of people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s are birding too. Participation among younger adults is surprisingly high, which raises a different possibility. Maybe birding doesn't belong to retirees. Maybe birding grows with people. Maybe as schedules slow down, as kids move out, as careers stabilize, people start looking closer at the natural world around them, and birding quietly fills that space. But age isn't the only factor determining who becomes a birder. When I started digging into the next set of numbers, the pattern became harder to ignore. Birding isn't just about age, it's also about income and education. The data shows something clear. The higher a person's income, the more likely they are to participate in birding. The same pattern shows up with education as well. People with a bachelor's degree have a participation rate well above the national average. Those with some college also trend higher. Meanwhile, participation drops significantly among people with less than a high school education. It's not a small gap. People with lower educational attainment participate at noticeably lower rates than the national average. And suddenly, the question shifts. Is birding truly as accessible as we think? On the surface, it feels free. You don't need a stadium. You don't need a membership. You don't even need to leave your backyard. But then you start thinking about optics, cameras, field guides, travel, time off work, property ownership, even something as simple as having a safe outdoor space nearby. Birding may appear simple, but it isn't always equal. And that realization adds complexity to the mystery. Because if participation rises with income and education, then birding isn't just a pastime. It reflects deeper social patterns and privilege. Who has time? Who has access? Who has the resources to look closely at nature instead of rushing past it? Now the picture is getting clearer. Birding is massive. It skews older. It trends upward with income and education. But there's one more layer to uncover. How diverse is this 96 million? If you made it this far, you're amazing. For more original birding content, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to this channel. Thanks, and now back to the show. This next clue forces a more uncomfortable question. Who isn't in the picture? When the survey breaks birders down by race, one number stands out immediately. About 75% of birders identify as white, or 3 out of every 4. That's a much higher share than the national population as a whole, which is estimated to be around 65% white. And yet, the story isn't as simple as it first appears. Asian Americans actually have the highest participation rate of any group. Nearly half participate. Meanwhile, participation rates among African Americans and Hispanics fall below the national average. So now, the mystery deepens. Birding is huge, but it isn't evenly distributed. Why? Is it access to green space, cultural exposure, generational tradition, representation in media, historical barriers to outdoor recreation? Here's the paradox. On paper, birding appears to be one of the most accessible outdoor activities. You can do it from a city balcony, from a sidewalk, from your front porch. And yet, the demographic picture suggests that access and participation aren't equal. That doesn't mean birding is exclusive by design, but it does mean that opportunity, outreach, and visibility still shapes who ends up holding binoculars. Even if birding involves 96 million Americans, there are still millions more who aren't participating, which makes the next clue even more interesting. At this point in the investigation, I assumed I knew where birding would be strongest: Florida, Texas, Arizona, and California. But the data is more nuanced. Of the 96 million birders, most were in the South Atlantic region, which isn't surprising since that region includes Florida, which has a lot of birds and a lot of retirees. But when participation rates are broken down by region, the highest participation rate is in the East South Central states, which includes Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama. Over 40% participation, meaning that if you're a birder in one of those states, there's a good chance that your friends and neighbors are also birders. Right behind them? The West North Central states, which includes the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, and Missouri, again around 40%. That's not the stereotype. It's not coastal elites. It's not just urban nature lovers with expensive cameras. And here's another twist. The largest metropolitan areas, cities with over 1 million residents, actually have the lowest participation rate. Yes, they have a lot of birders in total, simply because they have a lot of people. But proportionally, residents outside the biggest cities are more likely to bird, which makes sense. More access to open land, more space, slower pace, closer proximity to wildlife. But it also reinforces something we've been uncovering this whole time. Birding doesn't concentrate in obvious cultural hotspots. It spreads quietly across the country. In rural counties, in small cities, in suburban neighborhoods, and in backyards you'd never see on social media. But there's still one question left. Even if millions of people bird, how seriously do they take it? This next clue might be the most surprising of all. Up to this point, we've been counting people, but people alone don't tell you intensity. So I asked a different question. How often do these 96 million Americans actually bird? The answer changed everything. In 2022, birders collectively spent 7.5 billion days watching birds. 7.5 billion. That's billion with a B. On average, the typical birder watched birds about 78 days per year. That's roughly 1 out of every 5 days. Think about that. That's not a random hobby you dabble in twice a summer. That's something woven into your routine. Something that pulls you outside repeatedly, week after week. Backyard birders averaged more days than travelers, which also makes sense. When birds come to you, the barrier is lower. You can step outside for 10 minutes. You can glance out the kitchen window. You can build it into daily life. But here's another twist. Women, on average, logged more birding days than men. Not just around the home, but overall. That challenges another quiet stereotype. 90% of the top extreme birders are men, but when it comes to birding in general, the data paints a different picture. Of the 96 million birders, roughly 50% are women, regardless of whether it's around the home or away from home. The truth is, birding isn't just an occasional expedition just for men. For millions of Americans, both men and women, it's a habit. And when you multiply that level of engagement across tens of millions of people, you start to realize we're not just talking about a hobby. We're talking about a behavioral pattern embedded in American life. Which brings us to the final clue. Because when you combine 96 million people with 7.5 billion days, something else inevitably follows. Money. This is where the investigation stopped being interesting and started being shocking. In 2022, birders spent an estimated $108 billion. Let me say that again. $108 billion. That includes about $14 billion on trips, which includes food, lodging, transportation, and guide fees. But the big money is in equipment and land. That's over $93 billion. That includes binoculars, cameras, boats, campers, cabins, and property purchased specifically for wildlife viewing. And that's just direct spending. When economists modeled the ripple effects, which includes suppliers, wages, and downstream businesses, the total economic output tied to birding climbed to roughly $279 billion. It supported about 1.4 million jobs, $90 billion in employment income, and billions more in local, state, and federal tax revenue. This isn't a niche pastime. This isn't a quaint hobby. This is a massive industry, an economic engine hiding in plain sight. And suddenly, the earlier clues make sense. Why income matters, why travel birders matter, why participation patterns matter. Because when tens of millions of people consistently spend money on something, it becomes infrastructure. It becomes jobs. It becomes policy. It becomes political influence. And now the mystery has flipped. The real question isn't, how big is birding? The real question is, how did something this big stay so quiet? When I started this investigation, I thought I was looking into a quaint hobby, but the clues tell a different story. 96 million Americans, 7.5 billion days, $108 billion in spending, and over 1 million jobs supported. Birding isn't fringe. It's woven into backyards and road trips, into rural counties and dense suburbs, into the routines of older Americans, and growing among younger ones. It reflects income patterns, education gaps, regional culture, and evolving diversity. It's quiet, yes, but quiet doesn't mean small. In fact, that may be the reason it hides so well. Just like birds in a tree. Birding doesn't gather in stadiums. It doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't move as a single crowd. It happens in millions of separate places at once. A woman refilling a feeder before work, a retiree walking a familiar trail, or a college student scanning a city park between classes. Individually, it looks ordinary. Collectively, it's massive. So maybe birding doesn't feel big because it doesn't need to feel big. It doesn't announce itself. It simply continues, day after day, yard after yard, state after state. Hidden in plain sight,